Hi. This is one of the weird things I have in my office where I'm sitting now. I'm redoing it, so it's kind of a mess right now, but I have a lot of these sort of strange found objects, little taxidermy. Maybe I'll show you that later. But just wanted to share a little bit of my weirdness with you. All right, so this video is about the evolution of evolution, meaning the evolution of the idea that evolution could be a thing, right? The idea that that change over time in species, where species change, maybe some go extinct, maybe some new ones are created, the evolution of the idea that that was possible. All right, like usual, I'll just take you through a few of the slides. And first of all, I wanted to define evolution in a couple of different ways, right? So when we think of evolution, often people just think of like, oh, the controversy, between religion and science, or, the idea that people came from monkeys. And neither of those are actually a thing to me. I don't believe there is a controversy between religion and science. I think that those are two completely different spheres of knowledge. And I think that it's absolutely possible to be a person who has faith in any of the world's religions and at the same time understand the science of the world around us. Right? So I hope that when you go through this class, this will be something that you pursue for yourself, is your own understanding of how this relates to your belief system. And if you have strong religious beliefs, I don't want you to worry. I'm not going to ask you to give them up or anything. That would be ridiculous. What I'd like you to do is just figure out, negotiate how these things work for you, while still being willing to understand the science as we observe it and know it. So when the second thing that I wanted to debunk is this idea that we came from monkeys, right? So no one argues that we came from monkeys. The truth in terms of what we know from DNA and fossil evidence, or as close to the truth as we can get it, because we're always finding out more, right? That's the beauty of science, is that we share a common ancestor with apes. But we don't come directly from any modern apes, right? So we're not directly related to chimpanzees, gorillas, monkeys. Monkeys are not apes, but farther back in the family tree, actually we share an ancestor. So what that means is about 5 to 7 million years ago, there was an ancestor who was probably more ape-like than human-like, and the sort of apes branched off in one direction from this ancestor, and humans and all of our hominin ancestors, the sort of pre-humans and early humans, we branched off a different way. So if you want to think about how chimpanzees, for instance, and humans are related, the best way to think about it is cousins, right? Who share a great grandmother, right? So that great grandmother would be our common ancestor about 5 to 7 million years ago. And chimpanzees and other apes have been evolving. We've been evolving, obviously, in different ways, and we're all evolved to fit our environments, right? Humans are lucky in that we're smart and adaptive, and we can manipulate our environments in ways that other animals can't quite do, right? So just to, start off with a few, debunking of a few myths. So what is evolution as we'll understand it in this class? Well, you can look at several types of definitions of evolution. One is this one. It's the origin of plant and animal species through a process of development from earlier forms. right? So this just means that sort of everything comes from somewhere, right? The earliest forms that we know of are single-celled organisms, and then multicellular organisms, and then the great evolutionary bush of life. From there, things don't just appear out of a vacuum, and this is the idea that every generation there can be changes in members of a population, and those changes over a long period of time can add up to really big changes, right? So we'll take that as one idea, one way to look at evolution. And another way to look at it is on the genetic level, right? So the DNA. It's also a change in the genetic makeup of a population. So when I say a population, I'm talking about individual members of the same species, right? Members of the same species can interbreed together, and they can produce fertile offspring. So for instance, you can have wolves and dogs mate together. I mean, if the wolf doesn't eat the dog, and produce offspring that can then mate again and produce fertile offspring again, right? But if you have a horse and a donkey, you know what that makes, right? That's right, a mule. And mules are not fertile, right? So horses and donkeys are not the same species. They're related enough so that they can produce offspring, but a mule and another mule can't get together and make little mulitos, right? So they're not fertile. So that's one way that we can define species, right? And all of those changes, changes that would prevent two different but related species from producing fertile offspring, changes in our bodies, changes in the way things work in our bodies, changes in our appearance. All of these things are genetically based, right? So they have to be different in our genes before they show up in our bodies. So we can also think of evolution as the stuff that's going on in our DNA, right? Those changes that are being made in our DNA that will also manifest themselves, express themselves in our bodies. All right. So I'm going to move through these rather quickly. This section of the course focuses on a lot of people, a lot of ideas, this old taxonomy, and then the old taxonomy turned out to be wrong, right? Once we looked at the DNA, we found that this is actually the correct taxonomy. When you see cladistic, it means that it's from the examination of DNA, right? So this is a new way, new meaning a couple of decades old, new way to understand the primate taxonomy or primate classification system. Another way to look at it, right? So I'm going to move through these quickly and make sure you know all of these large figures in early understanding of biology and evolution. But I do want to focus on the difference between the ideas of two people. One is a guy named Lamarck. He has this really long French name. It's Jean-Baptiste de blah, blah, blah. I can't even remember it all, so we just call him Lamarck. And Lamarck had the idea that, building on these other previous ideas, also in the readings and the PowerPoint presentation, that change could happen with species, right? And this is a break from most of the thinking of the 17th century, 16th century, the scientific community as it was, right? There was no scientific community. They called themselves naturalists, right? Because there was no science as we know it today. They did not believe that things could change, right? Because they believed that God designed everything and everything as it was perfect. And so it took a lot of sort of, small pieces of evidence and theory, understanding, exploration, to finally get to the point where these naturalists could say, we see change happening in the world. It is real. So Lamarck was sort of the first person to put all these ideas together, although the way that he did it wasn't quite right. Right, so he had this idea called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and this is the idea that that traits acquired during someone's lifetime or something's lifetime, right? Because we're talking about all organisms, from insects to fish to plants to people, can be passed down to its offspring. Right? And he didn't really know how this could happen, but he thought maybe, like, if you're an anteater and you have a short nose, it's it's not easy for you to eat ants, and so you suffer, and so you send these subtle fluids and forces to the nose to make it bigger, and if you struggle with that enough, then that can be passed on to your offspring, and your little anteater babies will have longer noses. Right? So he had the idea of change, but not quite right, right? So this is how Lamarck's model of evolution would look. Let me move this a little bit so that you can, so that you can see it. Okay, so Lamarck's model of evolution. This is an image that you probably have in your book or something like it. And this image is of some giraffes, right? So what do you notice about, this group of orange giraffes right here? They have short necks, right? And they're all the same. So Lamarck had this idea that that populations, they were all pretty much exactly the same. And he understood that the environment could put pressure on organisms, right? Could put pressure on these individuals to survive, and that they would have to struggle, right? And send their subtle fluids and forces. And in this case, let's say the environmental change that happens to this group of giraffes, let's say they're living in East Africa and there's a drought. Right? So the drought makes the leaves fall from the trees. There's very few leaves. Not everybody can get what they need to eat. Not everybody can be happy, healthy, and sexy, right? And pass on their genes. And so only some of those giraffes are going to be able to, to get the leaves that they need. So how Lamarck saw this was that all those giraffes were going to struggle, and they were going to send their fluids and forces to their necks, and then in the next generation, their offspring would be born with longer necks, right? All of them, because they sort of happen, everything happens like in the whole population, right? This is not exactly correct, right? It's not correct at all. And so Lamarck didn't see that there was variation in individuals in the species, which is really important to the idea of change over time, how species can change over time and develop characteristics. So let me just take another minute and compare this to Darwin's model, right? So Darwin knew about Lamarck's model. Darwin, did some other exploration on his own, and as we talk about in the other PowerPoint, and did a lot of, breeding of animals for, his own purposes, pigeons and mollusks and things like this. So what Darwin understood that Lamarck didn't was that in any population there's variation. Right? So you can see that even in this first population, there's giraffes with shorter necks and giraffes with longer necks. So that's like any species, right? We all have variation. If you think about all the people that you know, right? We all look really different. We have different, there are different advantages that some of us have, different disadvantages, right? Susceptibility to disease, things like, other genetic issues. We have differences in height, differences in body structure in terms of like how wide our bodies are, how narrow our heads are, how our eyes look, our skin tones, things like that, right? So these are all normal and natural variations within a species. Every species has variations. Think about like also the cats, cats, right? Cats come in all different colors. And they're all the same species, right? domesticated cats, that is. All right, back to the giraffes. So Darwin